For years, a viral headline has circulated across social media, YouTube, and Ancestry forums, claiming that DNA has finally revealed a secret about Indigenous peoples that supposedly nobody wanted to admit. The hook is simple. Type O, blood, it claims, connects Native Americans to an ancient ancestral code hidden for centuries. But here's what's fascinating. There is no secret. The science proving this pattern was published decades ago in peer-reviewed journals. The only thing that was hidden wasn't suppressed by anyone. It was simply buried under sensationalism. You've probably seen these videos yourself. They come up in your recommended feed. They appear in Ancestry community forums. They get shared with comments like, "Finally, the truth is coming out," or "I always knew they were hiding this." The production quality is often slick. The claims are presented with confidence, and the underlying hook taps into something deeply human. The desire to know where you come from and to believe that science holds the keys to understanding your place in the world. But as is so often the case with viral narratives about genetics and ancestry, the real story is far more complicated and far less dramatic than the clickbait promises. The viral videos promise revelation with dramatic music and red text over DNA helixes. The thumbnails scream urgency. DNA finally revealed the truth. Experts don't want you to know this. Scientists have been hiding this for centuries. These videos accumulate millions of views and spread across continents, inspiring endless comment sections filled with people connecting blood type to heritage, ancestry, and identity itself. Yet, when you dig into the peer-reviewed research, when you follow the science back to its origins, you find something remarkable. The establishment wasn't hiding this at all. The academic world had already solved this puzzle. The real mystery isn't what science discovered. It's how that discovery got twisted into something it never was. Here's what we actually know. Native American populations do exhibit extraordinarily high frequencies of blood type O. In many North American tribes, the frequency exceeds 90%. In some populations, it approaches 100%. This isn't a controversial claim. This isn't contested. This is measurable fact documented across countless genetic studies. A 2009 research paper published by multiple institutions examined exon 6 and 7 sequence diversity in 180 O blood group individuals from 4 different Mesoamerican populations. The results were clear. The high frequency of blood type O was present in populations long before extensive contact with Europeans. The genetic pattern predates colonization, it predates Columbus, it predates any supposed modern cover-up. But here's where the viral narrative makes its critical error. It takes this legitimate scientific observation and wraps it in mystique. It suggests that somehow this pattern was unexpected, that scientists were shocked, that someone didn't want you to know. None of that is true. Population geneticists have understood why this happened for decades. And the answer, while scientifically sound, is far more mundane than any conspiracy. It's called the founder effect. The founder effect works like this. Imagine a small group of people from a large population decides to move to a new location. Maybe they're explorers. Maybe they're refugees. Maybe they're searching for better hunting grounds. These founders don't represent the full genetic diversity of their origin population. They carry with them whatever genetic traits they happen to possess. If by chance this founding group had a high proportion of individuals with type O blood, then their descendants will also have a high proportion of type O blood. This isn't selection. This isn't adaptation. This is just basic probability working through populations. Think about it mathematically. Let's say your origin population has roughly equal proportions of blood type O, A, and B, but your founding group of 50 people happens to include 38 people with type O blood and only 12 with other blood types. That's a significantly higher proportion than the parent population. As this small group reproduces and grows into thousands of people, the initial genetic composition of that founding group persists. The alleles they carried become more common simply because they started with higher frequencies. Over hundreds and thousands of years, as populations experience isolation and natural processes of genetic drift, these frequencies can remain stable or shift even further. This is exactly what appears to have happened with Native American populations. The genetic signal shows up clearly in ancient remains. Skeletal DNA from pre-Columbian populations demonstrates that high type O frequencies were already established long before Europeans arrived, which means this wasn't something that happened recently. This wasn't something that happened in the last 500 years. This was a pattern laid down thousands of years ago when the first populations were establishing themselves in the Americas. The ancestors of modern Native Americans migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age, when sea levels were considerably lower. Multiple waves of migration brought different populations to North and South America over thousands of years. The evidence suggests that the founding groups that established the initial populations in the Americas happened to carry a high frequency of the O blood type allele. As these populations expanded and diversified across 2 continents, This genetic signature remained remarkably stable. The O blood type became dominant not because it was superior, not because of natural selection, but because the people who arrived first happened to carry it. This explanation was accessible to population geneticists even before modern DNA sequencing technology emerged. But with contemporary research, the picture became even clearer. A study examining ancient DNA from Native American skeletal remains found that the high frequency of blood type O reflected patterns present in the ancient populations themselves. The genetic diversity was already low in pre-Columbian times. This means the founder effect happened thousands of years ago when populations were still small and isolated. Genetic drift, the random fluctuations in allele frequency that occur in small populations, would have further amplified this pattern over countless generations. And yet the viral world tells a completely different story. It suggests that what we're looking at is a hidden code, a suppressed truth. It frames type O blood as carrying some special significance about indigenous ancestry. It implies that scientists knew this, was profound, but kept quiet about it. It uses language designed to make you feel like you're accessing forbidden information. DNA finally revealed what no one wanted to admit. Scientists don't want you to know. These phrases construct a narrative of conspiracy where none actually exists. Consider the actual academic landscape. When researchers published their findings on blood type O in Native American populations, they didn't hide them. They published in peer-reviewed journals. They presented at scientific conferences. They made the data available to other researchers. The information was never secret. It was never suppressed. It was never controversial within the scientific community because the explanation was straightforward and consistent with established population genetics principles. The real secret, if you want to call it that, was that the secret didn't exist. What the viral narrative does exploit is something far more subtle. It plays on the genuine complexity of identity, ancestry, and what DNA can and cannot tell us. Indigenous peoples have rich cultural histories that predate genetic science by thousands of years. The way identity works in indigenous communities involves kinship, cultural practice, community recognition, and tribal sovereignty. It's not reducible to blood type or even modern DNA testing. But viral narratives suggest that DNA holds answers to questions about belonging and heritage. They promise that genetic testing can unlock truth about who you are and where you come from. This is where the misinformation becomes genuinely harmful. Indigenous researchers like Kim Tallbear, a Canada Research Chair in Indigenous Peoples, Technoscience and Environment, have warned extensively about the dangers of DNA testing being used to determine Indigenous identity. In her book titled Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science, Tallbear argues that tribal culture cannot be bottled in a test tube. DNA doesn't make you Indigenous. Community membership does. Cultural practice does. Recognition by your nation does. But viral headlines that promise DNA has revealed your ancestral code play directly into the false belief that genetics determines identity. This is more than just theoretical harm. Real consequences follow. Someone takes a DNA test. They learn they have Indigenous ancestry. They encounter a viral video claiming that type O blood reveals hidden ancestral truths. They begin to believe that their genetic profile is the most important aspect of their Indigenous heritage. They might never learn the languages their ancestors spoke. They might never participate in the cultural practices that define their nation. They might never make contributions to their community. But they have the DNA test results, which in their mind confirms their belonging. This false sense of genetic authentication creates problems at every level. It undermines tribal sovereignty because it suggests that membership can be determined by genetic testing rather than by tribal nations themselves. It appropriates Indigenous cultures for people who have no genuine community connection. It reduces extraordinarily complex and living cultural traditions to a question of ancestry percentages. These are the real harms. These are what we should be concerned about. This becomes especially problematic when you consider the historical context. For over a century, the United States and Canadian governments used blood quantum laws to legally define who counted as Indigenous. These policies required proof of a certain percentage of Native American ancestry to qualify for federal recognition or tribal membership. Blood quantum policies were explicitly designed to reduce the number of people counted as Native American over time. They were tools of genocide, disguised as legal definition. They used the language of blood and biology to diminish Indigenous populations and strip them of rights. The logic was simple and brutal. Define Indigenous identity by blood percentage. Establish that mixed-race children would have lower blood quantum. Watch as each generation becomes legally less Indigenous than the last. Eventually, the logic went, Indigenous people would be mathematically diluted out of existence while the government maintained the legal fiction that it was just following objective biological principles. Blood quantum policies affected everything: land rights, tribal membership, access to health care. federal services, the ability to vote in tribal elections, the framework of blood quantum, turned something as varied as cultural identity, community membership, and historical continuity into a number, a percentage, a fraction that could be calculated by government officials who often had no understanding of the cultures they were literally defining out of existence. This happened across generations. Thousands of Indigenous people were excluded from tribal roles based on blood quantum calculations. Children were separated from their nations based on genealogical percentages. Communities were fractured because the genetic line didn't meet the legal threshold. When viral headlines now promise that DNA has finally revealed the truth about Indigenous blood types, they're inadvertently reviving this problematic framework. They're suggesting that your blood, your genetics, your DNA, carries the truth of your identity. They're taking legitimate genetic science and channeling it into a framework that has historically been used against Indigenous peoples. The irony is that the very science these videos claim was hidden or suppressed actually contradicts the use they're making of it. Population genetics doesn't support the idea that blood type determines cultural identity or Indigenous belonging. It simply explains the frequency distribution of a trait across populations. The broader pattern here reveals something important about how misinformation spreads in the modern internet. It doesn't usually work by claiming something that's completely false. It works by taking something that's true and recontextualizing it. Blood type O is indeed very common in Native American populations. That part is accurate. But the viral narrative adds layers of meaning that simply aren't supported by science. It suggests that this pattern was hidden. It implies that revelation of this fact changes how we understand Indigenous identity. It frames the research as controversial when it isn't. This is a particular kind of sophistication in misinformation. A completely false claim is easy to debunk. You can point to the evidence and say this didn't happen. But when you start with something true and gradually layer on unsubstantiated implications, the debunking becomes more complex. You have to acknowledge what's accurate while explaining why the overall narrative is misleading. You have to engage with the viral framing without accidentally amplifying it. What makes these headlines particularly effective is that they promise access to something exclusive. They suggest that you're about to learn something that powerful institutions don't want you to know. This taps into very real historical traumas. Indigenous peoples have genuinely had knowledge systems suppressed. They have genuinely had their stories told by outsiders. They have genuinely had their sciences and histories marginalized in favor of European frameworks. So when a headline promises that finally the truth about Indigenous DNA will be revealed, it resonates with legitimate anger about past erasures. This is the insidious nature of this particular misinformation. It wraps itself in the language of decolonization. It pretends to be revealing what powerful interests wanted to hide, but what it's actually doing is taking real historical harm and weaponizing it to spread false claims. It's saying, look, Indigenous peoples were suppressed, so obviously science has been hiding things from you too. The logic feels sound, the historical parallels feel real, but it's a logical fallacy. Historical suppression of Indigenous knowledge doesn't mean that every conspiracy theory is true. It doesn't mean that modern genetic science is hiding revelations about blood type. The real decolonization work involves actual Indigenous peoples reclaiming their stories, their knowledge systems, their sovereignty over their nations. It involves listening to what Indigenous scholars and communities have to say about their own histories. It involves supporting Indigenous-led research and Indigenous scholarly frameworks. It doesn't involve watching viral videos about DNA codes and feeling like you've done the work. But the actual evidence doesn't support a conspiracy narrative. If anything, the opposite is true. Major institutions have funded research on Native American genetics. Academic papers on blood type frequencies in Indigenous populations have been available to anyone with library access for decades. The peer-reviewed literature is remarkably open about the mechanisms explaining these patterns. If there had been a conspiracy to hide this information, it would have required near-total coordination across multiple universities, government agencies, and international research institutions. It would have required constant suppression of published data. It would have required maintaining silence across hundreds of researchers across decades. That's not how science actually works. Consider the historical record. Blood type research in Native American populations goes back to the early 20th century. Scientists documented high type O frequencies decades before the internet, social media, or YouTube. When publishing required printing presses and distributing physical journals, these papers were still published, still available in academic libraries, still discussed in scientific conferences. Researchers cited each other's work, they built on each other's findings, they debated interpretations. This is the open process of science. It's not perfect. It has its own biases and limitations, but it's fundamentally transparent in a way that would make a conspiracy extraordinarily difficult to maintain. If someone wanted to truly hide research about blood type O in Native Americans, They would have had to suppress centuries of scientific literature. They would have had to convince researchers across dozens of countries to maintain silence. They would have had to prevent publication in journals that pride themselves on scientific rigor. None of that happened. The papers exist. The data is accessible. The mechanisms are explained. There's no hidden code. There's just science doing what science does. Science works through publication and replication. When something important is discovered, other researchers try to replicate the findings. They publish their own work. They debate interpretations. They challenge conclusions. The story of blood type O in Native American populations followed this exact pattern. Researchers examined the pattern. Other researchers asked questions about the mechanism. Studies were conducted. Hypotheses were tested. The founder effect explanation emerged not from one study, but from convergence of evidence across multiple independent teams. The academic process functioned exactly as it should. This doesn't mean that science has always treated Indigenous peoples well. The history of genetics research involving Native Americans is deeply complicated. There have been genuine problems. Research has sometimes been conducted without proper consent. Genetic samples have been taken without full understanding of how they'd be used. Results have sometimes been interpreted through a lens of racial hierarchy, rather than neutral population genetics. These are real criticisms that Indigenous scholars and communities have raised, and they're worth taking seriously. But the solution to those problems isn't conspiracy theories about hidden DNA revelations. It's stronger ethical frameworks, better collaboration with Indigenous communities, and more transparency in how genetic research is conducted and interpreted. The viral narrative, by presenting itself as revealing suppressed truth, actually obscures these more complex and legitimate concerns. It suggests that the main problem is that information was hidden when the real problem involves questions of consent, collaboration, and how research is interpreted. It reduces a multifaceted issue to a simple story of hidden knowledge finally being revealed. This is much easier to package into a viral video, but it's also much less accurate. When you look at what the actual research shows, the picture is remarkably clear and straightforward. Native American populations have high frequencies of type O blood. This appears to reflect founder effects in the early populations that colonized the Americas. The genetic pattern predates European contact. The mechanism explaining this pattern has been understood for decades through standard population genetics principles. There's no controversy. There's no suppression. There's no hidden code. There's just human biology working through the normal processes of population genetics and migration. What makes this case particularly interesting from the perspective of misinformation is that it shows how effective these narratives can be even when they're built on something true. The blood type pattern is real, but the interpretation is fabricated. The people sharing these videos aren't lying about the frequency of type O blood in native populations. They're lying about what it means and why it's significant. They're lying about whether it was hidden. They're lying about the motivations of scientists. They're lying about what this tells us about Indigenous identity. And in doing so, they're creating a false framework for understanding both genetics and Indigenous history. This matters because DNA testing is increasingly common. More and more people take ancestry tests hoping to learn about their heritage. Many of those people have some Indigenous ancestry. When they encounter these viral narratives about blood type O revealing hidden ancestral codes, they might internalize the message that DNA determines their Indigenous identity. They might believe that a high percentage on an ancestry report makes them genuinely Indigenous, and in doing so, they might not engage with the actual complex work of cultural learning, community connection, and respectful relationship building that genuine Indigenous identity involves. This is a subtle harm. It's not the intentional conspiracy that the viral videos claim is happening, but it's a real distortion of how we understand the relationship between genetics, ancestry, and identity. It's a weaponization of popular science that serves neither scientific accuracy nor Indigenous communities. It serves engagement algorithms and video view counts. It serves people who want to build audiences by promising forbidden knowledge, but it doesn't serve anyone genuinely interested in understanding either genetics or Indigenous history. The research on blood type in Native Americans continues to evolve. Scientists are asking new questions. They're investigating the genetic architecture of different populations. They're examining how various alleles have changed over time and across populations. But these investigations don't show a hidden code being revealed. They show normal science progressing normally, studying patterns that have been known for a long time with increasing sophistication and nuance. The story of blood type O in Native American populations isn't a story of suppression followed by revelation. It's a story of how genetic patterns can be understood through the principles of population genetics, and how those patterns have been stable across thousands of years of human migration and settlement. Researchers have looked at whether blood type O provides any special protection against disease. For years, some publications suggested correlations between type O blood and malaria resistance. But other publications disputed these findings. The scientific consensus today is that there's no significant selective advantage to having any particular blood type, which means the high frequency of type O in Native Americans isn't evidence that it was somehow better adapted to the American environment. It's evidence that the founding populations happened to carry it. During the COVID-19 pandemic, researchers investigated whether blood type played a role in disease susceptibility. Some studies suggested that people with type A blood were more likely to have severe illness, while type O individuals were less likely. But the effect sizes were modest, and the evidence was tentative. The scientific community was appropriately cautious. Scientists didn't jump to conclusions. They recognized the limitations of the data. This is exactly how science is supposed to work. Hypothesis, investigation, cautious interpretation, more investigation. This is also precisely the opposite of how viral narratives frame scientific discovery. No tentative findings, no nuance, just finally revealed in big red letters on a black background. If you have Native American ancestry and type O blood, what this actually means from a genetic standpoint is relatively simple. You inherited 2 copies of the O blood type allele, one from each parent. Each of them likely inherited it from their parents, and so on backward through your family tree. This inheritance pattern has nothing to do with whether you belong to a tribe. It has nothing to do with your cultural identity. It has nothing to do with what your ancestors knew or believed or practiced. It's just a protein system on the surface of your red blood cells. Important for blood transfusions, not important for determining who you are. What genuinely matters about Indigenous ancestry is learning the real history of the Indigenous nations you descend from, understanding their ongoing cultures and practices, recognizing the sovereignty and self-determination of Indigenous communities, supporting Indigenous peoples in their struggles against continued conversations that matter. These are the actions that create genuine change. These are the ways that you can actually honor Indigenous heritage. Sharing viral videos that promise DNA has revealed secret codes doesn't accomplish any of this. If anything, it distracts from it. The viral headline we started with is still circulating. Millions of people have probably encountered it. Some of them will have watched the full video. Some of them will have believed it. Some of them might share it with others, spreading the narrative further. But understanding the actual science behind blood type frequencies in Native American populations gives you tools to push back on this narrative. It gives you the ability to see how legitimate genetic facts get twisted into false implications. It gives you the framework to distinguish between what scientists actually discovered and what conspiracy narratives want you to believe. In the end, the most interesting thing about this story isn't that DNA revealed some hidden code about Indigenous identity. The most interesting thing is that we've created a media environment where taking something that's been publicly known for decades and repackaging it as forbidden knowledge can generate millions of views. We're adding the word finally and suggesting that someone doesn't want you to know makes people. Narrative of conspiracy is more compelling to audiences than the narrative of how science actually works. That's the real revelation here, not about Indigenous blood types, but about how we consume information and what we've collectively decided is worth paying attention to. We live in an age of information abundance. You can access peer-reviewed research. You can read academic papers. You can learn the mechanisms explaining any genetic pattern you're curious about. And yet, we're choosing to consume repackaged conspiracy narratives instead. We're choosing to believe that something was hidden when the evidence shows it was openly published. We're choosing dramatic storytelling over scientific accuracy. We're choosing engagement over understanding. These choices have consequences. When it comes to Indigenous identity and ancestry, those consequences are particularly serious. We're reducing living cultures to genetic percentages. We're replacing community and relationship with DNA tests. We're letting algorithm-driven media distort our understanding of who we are and where we come from. The question moving forward becomes, how do we do better? How do we engage with science in a way that's both curious and critical? How do we explore questions about ancestry and identity without reducing them to genetic testing and viral narratives? How do we honor Indigenous history without appropriating it through misunderstood DNA testing? How do we build media literacy so that we can spot when something true is being recontextualized into something false? These are the questions that matter. These are the conversations we should be having. And unlike the promise of hidden DNA codes, these conversations might actually change something about how we understand ourselves and each other.